The Red Herring, a chilling tale of fear and deception. Hook! Have you ever felt like you were being watched by something unnatural? What if your deepest fears weren't just in your mind, but were following you every step of the way? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a terrifying twist that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. The night was suffocating, heavy with fog. Jack's footsteps echoed down the empty alley, each one a reminder of his isolation. The air smelled of rain, thick and damp. He pulled his coat tighter around his chest, but the chill never quite left. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. He wasn't alone. He had felt it for a while now, something following him. But whenever he turned, the alley was empty. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a creeping unease settling over him. His pace quickened. He didn't look back, but the feeling grew stronger. Someone or something was behind him. His pulse pounded in his ears. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a blanket. Then a sound. A soft shuffle. A whisper of a footstep. His heart skipped. It was too close. Jack spun around. The alley was still empty. His breath was shallow now, his chest tight with anxiety. Nothing moved. But then, at the edge of his vision, a flash of red. It was quick, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Red. Was it a car? A sign? His mind raced. Nothing made sense. He turned back around, eyes scanning the darkness. The fog parted briefly, and in that moment he saw something ahead. A figure, tall, unmoving. It wore a red scarf, the color vivid against the murky gray of the night. Jack's stomach twisted. He didn't want to approach, but he couldn't stop himself. Step by step, he drew closer. The figure remained still. As he neared, he could feel the hairs on his arms rise. The red scarf fluttered slightly in the breeze. The figure was just ahead now, but it didn't seem to notice him. It was as if the world had frozen around it. And then suddenly it turned its head. Jack froze. Its face was hidden, buried beneath a hood. A chill ran through him. The figure took a slow step forward, its shadow stretching toward him. Without thinking, Jack stumbled backward, a scream rising in his throat. But he was too slow. A hand shot out from beneath the cloak, grabbing him, pulling him closer. The air was thick now, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. The red scarf flared again in his vision, and then, just as suddenly, the figure was gone. Jack was left standing alone in the fog, his heart racing. Nothing. He was alone, but something didn't feel right. The sensation of being watched lingered, heavy in the air. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't leave. Not yet. Jack's feet felt like lead. The fog was thicker now, almost impenetrable. He took a step forward, hesitant, but his body moved without his permission. Every inch felt like it was taking him deeper into a trap. The alley stretched endlessly before him. The silence was oppressive. He could almost taste it. A distant sound reached his ears, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, but there was no wood here, just stone and concrete. He stopped, frozen again. The scratching grew louder, closer. It was coming from above. Jack's head snapped up. Nothing. Just the endless swirl of fog and the dim flicker of streetlights. Then a figure appeared, not in front of him, but above, on the rooftop, a silhouette, tall, looming. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the roof like a shadow. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The red scarf flashed again. There was no mistake. It was the same figure, the same flash of color. His pulse raced. Every instinct told him to run, to get out, but he couldn't move. The figure stopped at the edge of the roof. Jack could feel his blood run cold. It stood there watching him, unmoving. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than ever. The figure leaned forward. For a moment, Jack thought it might jump, The fog swirled, as if anticipating the fall. Then, without warning, the figure dropped. A blur of red streaked through the mist. Jack's breath stopped. He didn't see it land, but he heard something, a thud, a soft grunt. He turned, and before he could react, something slammed into his chest. The world spun. He was on the ground now, his back against the cold pavement. The red scarf was draped across his face, blinding him. He struggled, but a weight pressed down on him, pinning him. A voice whispered, so close, in his ear. You shouldn't have followed. Jack's heart pounded, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to scream, but the air was knocked from his lungs. Then, the voice laughed softly. It was low, almost familiar, but wrong. He didn't know who it was, but somehow he did. The pressure on his chest eased. Just enough. Jack gasped for breath. The red scarf fell away, and there, standing above him, was the last person he expected to see. It was his brother Alex. But not the Alex Jack remembered. His face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark rings under his eyes. His expression was cold, unreadable. Jack's breath hitched. Alex, he whispered, his voice trembling. Alex didn't answer. He simply stared down at Jack, his gaze hollow. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fog swirled around them, thick and choking. Jack tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't respond. Something was wrong. Everything felt wrong. Alex reached down slowly. A twisted, faint smile tugged at his lips. You should have stayed away, Alex murmured. His voice was hollow, distant. It didn't sound like him. Jack's heart raced again. He pushed himself up, his hands shaking. Where have you been? Jack gasped, trying to make sense of it all. Alex took a step back, keeping his distance. The streetlights flickered again. His brother's red scarf swayed with the wind, almost mockingly. Does it matter? Alex's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through Jack's chest like a blade. Jack could feel the weight of those words. He didn't understand. I thought you were dead, Jack stammered. Alex's eyes narrowed. There was something dark behind them now. Everyone thought I was... He sounded like a stranger. Jack couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, suffocating. Where have you been, Alex? Jack repeated, more desperately this time. But Alex's face twisted, a sharp grin spreading across his lips. You don't want to know. His voice was so low now, it sent shivers down Jack's spine. Before Jack could respond, Alex turned his back to him. The red scarf fluttered in the breeze, drawing Jack's gaze. And then, as if in slow motion, Alex began to walk away. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he knew Jack wouldn't follow. But Jack couldn't stop himself. His legs moved, carrying him forward. The coldness of the night clung to him. He reached out, grabbing for Alex's arm. But Alex was no longer there. He was gone, vanished. In his place stood nothing but the fog. Jack's heart pounded painfully in his chest. He felt dizzy, confused, lost. There was no trace of his brother. Nothing but emptiness. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. But not Alex's. Someone else. Someone closer. Jack turned. He saw nothing. Yet the presence was undeniable. A voice whispered from behind him. You shouldn't have followed. It was Alex again. But no, it wasn't. The voice was different. Familiar, but twisted. And in that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't his brother. It couldn't be. His breath caught in his throat. The fog swirled around him once more. Jack's pulse raced, but there was no escape. The whispering grew louder. It echoed in his ears, swirling with the fog, feeding his panic. Jack spun around again. Nothing, just the oppressive dark. The silence was maddening. The footsteps, though, he could hear them. Closer, closer still. Jack's skin prickled. His breath came in shallow gasps. He took a step back, his heart pounding, and then he saw it. A figure in the fog. But this time it wasn't Alex. It was someone else. A woman, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes. Her face was pale, like death itself. Her lips were cracked, twisted into a faint smile. She wore a red dress, stained dark, with something Jack couldn't name. The figure took a step forward, her bare feet barely making a sound. Jack's legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot. The woman's eyes locked onto his. There was no warmth in them, only cold, empty darkness. She raised a hand slowly, a long, bony finger pointed straight at him. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Her voice was like a breath on the wind, fragile, yet full of malice. Jack couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The woman's finger never wavered, and in that moment, Jack felt it. A coldness creeping inside him, as if the air around him had frozen. The fog thickened. It seemed to swallow everything whole. The woman took another step, and Jack stumbled backward. He could hear the faint scratch of her nails against the stone beneath her feet, but the sound was wrong, like claws dragging along the ground. Her smile stretched wider, her eyes narrowing. "You're already too late," she murmured. Jack's stomach twisted. Too late? Too late for what? His heart raced, his thoughts spiraling. The woman advanced. Closer. Closer. He tried to move. His legs screamed at him to run. But the fog held him. It wrapped around him, suffocating him. He turned his head, trying to look for an escape, but it was everywhere now. The fog swallowed the street, swallowed the world. The woman was too close now. Jack could feel the cold of her presence pressing into him. A cold that wasn't just in the air, but in his bones. A sharp, biting chill that took his breath away. She was right in front of him now. Her hand reached up, brushing against his cheek. It was ice. Pure, frigid ice. His skin burned, but in a way that felt unnatural. Then she spoke again. "Welcome to the end." And with that, the world around Jack exploded into darkness. Jack's senses were overwhelmed. The cold, the darkness, the pressure around him. He gasped, trying to find air, but there was nothing but the suffocating blackness. He stumbled forward, his hands reaching out into the void, searching for anything to hold on to. His fingers brushed against something soft, but cold as ice. A cloth. A red cloth. He jerked his hand back, a chill running through his body. His mind raced. Was it the red scarf? But how? He tried to push past the fear, tried to focus, but the darkness seemed to tighten around him. The woman's voice echoed in his head. "Welcome to the end." He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The fog thickened again. A faint light flickered in the distance. Jack forced himself to move toward it, each step dragging with impossible weight. But the more he walked, the farther away the light seemed to get. His legs burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. The air felt thick with an unseen pressure. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A figure, standing motionless in the distance. It was barely visible through the fog, but Jack recognized the shape. The figure was tall. It had the same silhouette as the one he had seen before. The same red scarf fluttering faintly in the mist. His heart leaped. It was Alex. No, it couldn't be. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Jack moved closer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Jack stopped, his pulse quickening. He couldn't go any farther, not with that figure ahead of him. The fog was so thick now that the world felt like it was closing in on him. Every direction seemed wrong. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He was trapped. "Alex." Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like it echoed through the thick fog. The figure didn't answer, just stood there motionless. Jack took a step forward, his body trembling. A sudden coldness washed over him, colder than before. He felt as if the very air around him had turned to ice. His limbs felt heavy, his thoughts clouded. The figure began to turn slowly. Its movements were unnatural, like something not quite human. Then, for the first time, Jack saw its face. It wasn't Alex. It wasn't anyone he knew. The face was hollow, a mask of death itself. The eyes were black voids. The mouth twisted into a grin, stretching too wide, too impossibly wide. Jack's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. The figure took a slow step toward him. The red scarf seemed to glow in the mist, pulsing like it had a life of its own. Jack couldn't move. The figure reached up, as if to touch his face. But just before the cold fingers could reach him, the world around him shattered. The fog, the figure, everything dissolved into nothing. Jack was falling through endless darkness. The weightlessness twisted his stomach, his thoughts spinning. But just as suddenly his feet hit solid ground, his body slammed into the cold concrete. He gasped for air. His eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting to the sharp light. He was back in the alley. The fog was gone. The woman, the figure, everything was gone. But something was wrong. The red scarf was still there, on the ground in front of him. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any scarf. It was his own. The cold returned with a jolt, seeping through his skin. He slowly reached down and picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, the ground beneath him shook, the ground trembled beneath him, violent and unrelenting. Jack's breath hitched as he scrambled to his feet, his hands still clutching the red scarf. The earth seemed to groan, as though the very city was waking up. His pulse raced. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't stay here. Not in this place. The alleyway was silent now, eerily so. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Jack turned, eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no sign of the figure, no one watching. He moved quickly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pulling him back, holding him here. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't think about it. Not now. The scarf still clung to his hand like a lifeline, but there was something wrong with it. It felt alive, twitching ever so slightly in his grip. Jack's hand shot out, flinging it away from him. The scarf hit the ground, but as soon as it touched the pavement, it started to move. The fabric twisted and coiled on itself, like a snake. Jack stumbled backward in horror, but the scarf followed. It slithered toward him, faster than he could react. Panic surged through him as he tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. His body screamed for him to move, but the weight of the air, the heaviness of the night, it was all too much. The scarf inched closer, its red color stark against the dark ground. He could feel the pull of it, a magnetic force, dragging him back. "Leave me alone," Jack breathed, his voice shaky. The scarf stopped a few feet away. Then it seemed to stop moving altogether, its fabric quivering slightly, as if waiting for him. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to go near it, but something was telling him to. A whisper, barely audible, tickling his ear. "Pick it up." The voice was soft, almost familiar. No, not familiar, wrong. It wasn't anyone he knew, but the command was clear. The scarf seemed to pulse now, as if breathing, as if alive. His hand reached out, almost against his will. It was as though something was forcing him to touch it. His fingers brushed the fabric, and instantly everything went black. The world around him twisted and warped. The ground disappeared. The air went thick with a suffocating pressure. His chest tightened, but it wasn't air he needed. It was something else, something dark. The darkness folded around him like a cloak, pulling him deeper into it. And then, just as quickly, everything stopped. A sudden silence. No movement, no sound, no breath. Jack opened his eyes, but he wasn't in the alley anymore. He was standing in a vast, empty space. Endless. The floor beneath him was smooth, cold stone. Above, an infinite black sky stretched on, as though it had no beginning or end. The red scarf was in his hands again, but it was different now. It pulsed with a rhythm of its own. He could feel it. The scarf was alive. It wasn't just fabric. It was a part of this place, part of whatever this was. Where am I? Jack whispered into the void, but his voice echoed back at him, hollow and distant. The darkness pressed in on him. It was suffocating, and yet, somewhere in the distance, faint at first, he could hear something. A sound, a soft laugh. It was coming closer. Jack's heart dropped, and in the distance he saw it. A figure, tall, draped in shadows. A faint red glow surrounded it, just like the scarf. The laugh echoed again, and the figure took a step forward. The figure moved closer, its form shifting with each step, as if it were more shadow than substance. Jack's body stiffened. His breath caught in his throat. The laugh, a low, mocking sound, grew louder. It felt like it was inside his head, echoing through his skull, reverberating against his thoughts. The red glow intensified, casting strange reflections on the cold stone floor. Jack tried to step back, but his feet refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot. The figure was now just a few paces away. Its form began to solidify, taking shape. A tall figure cloaked in black, the red scarf wrapped tightly around its neck, the end of it fluttering as if caught in an invisible breeze. And then Jack saw the face. It wasn't human. The eyes were hollow, deep voids of black that seemed to swallow the light. The skin was pale, almost lifeless. A grin stretched across the face, too wide, too unnatural. Jack's chest tightened as if the air itself had turned to lead. "Do you know what you've done?" the figure whispered. Its voice was cold, flat, void of any warmth, but somehow familiar. Jack's heart raced. "What are you?" he choked out. The figure tilted its head slightly, its hollow gaze never leaving his. "You know me," it said, its voice now a hiss. Jack's stomach churned. This wasn't right. None of this was real. But everything felt so real. The weight of the air, the oppressive silence, the way his heart pounded in his chest. Too fast, too loud. "Why am I here?" Jack managed, his voice barely a whisper. The figure stepped closer. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him once again, a low, rumbling sound. "You followed," the figure replied. "You ignored the warning." The red scarf fluttered again, a slight movement that felt like a threat. "You should have never come here." The voice was almost a growl now, the words twisted with malice. Jack could feel it, a crushing pressure pulling at him from every direction. The scarf, it wasn't just a scarf. It was a tether, a connection to something beyond this place, something that didn't belong in the world, a part of whatever dark force this figure represented. "Leave me alone," Jack whispered, his body trembling. He tried to move, to break free, but the force holding him in place was too strong. The figure raised a hand slowly, a long, bony finger pointing at Jack. "You can't escape it," it hissed. "Not now. Not ever." Jack's chest tightened again, and his eyes stung with the pressure of tears he couldn't shed. He tried to speak, to beg, but the words stuck in his throat. The figure stepped closer, closer still. Jack's breath quickened as he felt the chill of its presence wash over him, cold and suffocating. The darkness seemed to close in even tighter, until there was nothing but the black void and the sound of his own heartbeat. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. But it wasn't toward him. It was toward the red scarf. Jack's hand shot out instinctively to protect it, but the scarf slipped from his grasp. It moved of its own accord, a red blur that twisted and writhed like a living thing. The figure reached for it, and just as its fingers touched the fabric, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the scarf. Jack screamed. His eyes slammed shut against the searing light. The ground shook violently beneath him. A roar filled the air, like the world itself was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence returned. The weight lifted. Jack opened his eyes. The figure was gone. The red scarf lay on the ground before him, unmoving. His breath came in shallow gasps. What had just happened? Where was he? The space around him felt different. Not lighter, not brighter, but something had changed. He felt it deep inside him. A cold emptiness had settled where fear once lived. He was alone, completely alone. But as he stood there, staring at the red scarf, he realized something was watching him. Somewhere in the shadows that Jack's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing straight. He felt it, an unshakable presence, lurking just beyond his sight. His eyes darted around the empty space, but the shadows seemed deeper now, darker than before. The red scarf lay on the ground, perfectly still, but Jack couldn't tear his gaze away from it. It was calling to him, a silent whisper, urging him to pick it up, but he couldn't, not anymore. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to leave, to run as far as he could, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows stretched, swallowing the stone beneath his feet. Jack's breath was shallow now, his chest tight, with an invisible weight, and then a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. "Do you see it?" The voice came from behind him. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. His muscles tensed, but he couldn't move. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Do you see it?" He turned slowly, the dread curling in his stomach. A figure stepped from the shadows. It was not the same as before, but it was something equally terrifying. This one was smaller, hunched, its body twisted unnaturally, like it was made from the very darkness around it. Its eyes were wide, almost too wide, the pupils black holes that swallowed everything they looked at, and its smile. It stretched impossibly far across its face, jagged and wrong, like it had been carved with a knife. Jack's stomach lurched. Who are you?" he managed to gasp, his voice hoarse. The figure tilted its head, the movement jerky, as if it were an old puppet being pulled by strings. "You already know," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. The figure took a step closer, its shadow growing long and twisted as it moved toward him. Jack's throat tightened. No, I don't," he choked out. The figure laughed, a sound like nails scraping against glass. "You will." The words crawled over Jack's skin, sending a wave of icy fear through him. The figure raised a hand, its fingers thin and elongated, pointed like claws. "Pick it up." The command was a low murmur, but it was heavy, impossibly so. Jack felt it in his bones, in his very blood. The red scarf lay still at his feet, but now it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, beckoning. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and Jack knew. He knew what it wanted. It wasn't the scarf it wanted him. The realization hit him like a wave. This was the moment. This was where everything ended. There was no escape, no way to outrun it. Jack's body moved before his mind could catch up. His hand reached for the scarf. It was as if his own will had betrayed him. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, a jolt of electric cold shot up his arm, flooding his chest, his heart. He gasped, his vision swimming, his mind tearing at the edges. The figure's grin grew wider. "Yes," it hissed, stepping even closer now. Jack's hand clenched around the scarf. The world blurred. The shadows thickened, the darkness folding in. And then, all at once, the ground beneath him cracked open. The scream he didn't even realize he was holding back tore from his throat. And everything went black. The darkness swallowed him whole. It was complete, impenetrable. Jack couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet anymore. He couldn't hear his breath. Everything was suffocatingly silent. A weight pressed down on him, heavy, like 1,000 pounds of stone. The red scarf burned in his hands, the fabric now searing against his skin. His heart raced. Panic clawed at his chest. But there was no escape. There was no air, no sound, just the suffocating pressure and the constant hum of something wrong. The edges of his vision flickered, distorting. Something was shifting. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his throat closed tight, and then, through the thick void, he saw it. A faint light. It was so small, so distant, but it grew, larger, closer. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was a sickly, pale glow. Jack felt himself being pulled toward it. His body moved as if it were no longer his own. The light stretched out before him, expanding like a hole in the darkness. His heart pounded louder. It was coming closer, closer still, and then he heard it. A voice, faint, a whisper. "Welcome back." The words slid into his mind like a cold, jagged blade. His legs moved faster now, desperate. The light grew larger, revealing a figure, tall, standing in the center of it. The glow around it flickered and dimmed. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew this figure, but it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't Alex. It wasn't the woman. It was something worse. A distorted version of himself. A twisted reflection. The face was his, but wrong. It was pale, ghostly white, the eyes hollow and empty. The smile was stretched unnaturally wide, jagged and grotesque. The figure raised its hand, a perfect replica of Jack's own, and with a sickening crack, it twisted the fingers like they were made of brittle glass. "Do you see it now?" the figure asked, its voice a mocking whisper of Jack's own. The cold spread through Jack's chest, a freezing wave that gripped his heart. "Do you understand?" Jack's hand, still holding the red scarf, trembled violently. It felt as though the fabric was trying to pull him in, to bind him to this place, to this thing. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The twisted figure stepped closer, its grin widening with every step. It reached out, slow, deliberate. "Everything you've done," the figure hissed. "It's all connected." The words sent a shock through Jack's body. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn, to run, to escape. But there was no escape. Not now. The figure placed a cold hand on his chest. Jack gasped as if the touch had stolen the air from his lungs. "Pick it up," the figure whispered again. The voice was now joined by hundreds of others, a chorus of whispers indistinguishable, rising from the very depths of the darkness. The red scarf in his hand burned hotter, hotter still. Jack's vision blurred as the pressure in his chest grew unbearable. The figure's grin was the last thing he saw. And then the world exploded into light. The light was blinding. It consumed everything. Jack felt his body jerk, as if the very fabric of reality had snapped. The red scarf burned in his hands like fire, searing his skin. A sound like rushing wind filled his ears, deafening him, overwhelming him. His heart pounded harder and harder, like a drumbeat, until he couldn't tell if it was his heart or the earth itself shaking. The light stretched, bent, and then everything stopped. A deafening silence descended. Jack blinked, disoriented. The world around him had changed again. He was no longer in the void. He was back in the alleyway, the cold concrete beneath his feet. The fog was gone. The red scarf, still in his hand, no longer burned. But the air was thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. And the silence, it was suffocating. Jack looked around, his breath shallow. The alley was empty. No figures, no shadows, no sign of the twisted reflections, just a hollow emptiness stretching out before him. He took a step forward, still clutching the red scarf. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. As he walked, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Not violently, just a subtle vibration, as if something ancient was stirring beneath the surface. Jack's footsteps slowed. A faint laugh echoed through the alley. It was soft, almost playful, but it made his blood run cold. The laugh grew louder, more distinct, and then he heard it. A voice. Familiar. Jack. He froze. The voice was Alex's, but it wasn't right. It sounded hollow, distorted. Jack's throat tightened as he turned slowly. Behind him, in the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, a faint outline. But as it drew closer, Jack's heart stopped. It was Alex, but again, not Alex. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were hollow, black pits, empty of life. The red scarf hung loosely around his neck. Jack's breath hitched. No, it can't be you, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. But Alex, or whatever this thing was, took another step closer, the faintest smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's always been me, Jack," the figure said, its voice cold and flat, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Jack's hands shook, his fingers tightening around the red scarf. The laughter continued, echoing, filling the alley. "Don't you get it?" Alex's voice was almost mocking. "This is the end." The words sent a chill through Jack's spine. But before he could respond, the figure, Alex, vanished. Gone. Just like that. Jack stood there, heart pounding in his chest. But the laughter didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere now. The shadows around him seemed to shift, to stretch. The air grew thick again, as if the world was folding in on itself. Jack turned quickly, his pulse racing. The alley, his only escape, was narrowing. The walls were closing in. The red scarf in his hand felt heavier, colder. He could hear footsteps, soft and slow, echoing from behind him. But there was no one there. And then his breath caught in his throat. A shadow moved at the corner of his vision. Too quick, too close. The temperature dropped, and Jack felt a presence looming. The figure in the shadows stepped forward. It was Alex again, but not really Alex. The hollow eyes locked onto Jack's, and the smile stretched wider. A twisted, mocking grin. "You're still here," it whispered. "You didn't leave." Jack's heart raced. And then everything went black again. The blackness swallowed him whole once more. Jack's body jerked, his limbs numb. His mind, too disoriented, swirling in a void of confusion and terror. His heart thudded in his chest, deafening, as though it were the only sound left in the world. He tried to scream, but no sound came. No breath. There was nothing but that crushing, suffocating silence. And then a crack of light, a sliver at first, but it grew, widening, brighter. Jack's eyes fluttered open, the world blinding, too bright. The alley? No, it was different now. The walls were gone, replaced by something vast, endless. The ground beneath him was soft, damp, like the earth was alive beneath him. The red scarf was still clutched tightly in his hands, but the weight of it felt wrong. He could feel the fabric twisting, pulsating in his grip as though it was alive, pushing against him, urging him forward. He stumbled to his feet, the ground shifting beneath him. He was no longer in the alley. He was somewhere else. Somewhere else. The air was heavy, thick with something dark and cold. It was as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. The trees, if they could even be called trees, towered above him, their twisted, gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, grabbing at the fog that hung low in the air. The place felt wrong. Not a place where life thrived, but where it had once been before everything had died, before he had arrived. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't real. None of it was. His fingers clenched tighter around the scarf. The soft rustling sound came again. Faint whispers. Too faint. Too close. His skin crawled. Then a voice. One familiar. Jack. A soft, teasing whisper. He whipped around, searching for its source. But there was no one. Nothing. Yet the voice was clear in his mind. Do you see it? It was Alex's voice. Asterisk, but it wasn't Star. Jack's pulse quickened. Where are you? Jack shouted, his voice breaking in the thick, oppressive air. And then, through the fog, a figure appeared, slowly, like a shadow emerging from the depths. It moved with purpose, but Jack couldn't see its face. Only the shape of it, tall, slender, draped in shadows. Red cloth fluttered at its neck. The red scarf. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The figure stepped closer, and Jack's breath caught. He knew it. It wasn't just the scarf. It was the feeling, the coldness of it, the weight of the presence. Jack. The voice again, soft, almost loving. It was everywhere now. The figure moved closer. Closer still. It stepped into the faint light, its form slowly becoming more distinct. Jack's eyes widened in horror. It was Alex. But, asterisk, not Star. The eyes were hollow, black holes. The skin was ashen gray, pulled tight against the skull. The smile. No, not a smile. A twisted, cruel grin stretched too far across its face. Jack stumbled back, his body stiff with dread. The figure's hand reached toward him, impossibly long fingers extending. No, no, Jack shouted, trying to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure stepped forward, the air growing colder, the shadows pressing in around them. You didn't leave, Jack, the voice echoed. Each word was like a death knell. You never left. You've always been here. Jack's breath hitched. No, I'm not you, Jack gasped, his chest tightening as he felt the weight of the presence crush him. The figure laughed, soft, dark, a laugh that held no joy. No, it said, but you will be. Jack's eyes widened in realization. The scarf, it wasn't just a tether. It was a chain to this place, to this thing. The figure reached closer, its fingers now inches from Jack's face. And the world began to spin. Jack could feel himself falling, his body weightless. The figure's laugh echoed in his ears. The last thing Jack saw before the darkness consumed him again was the red scarf, fluttering in the wind, like a signal, a call to Jack's eyes snapped open. But the world was different. The darkness that had consumed him was gone. The fog, the shadows, the suffocating silence. Asterisk all gone, Star. Instead, he found himself standing in a place that should have been familiar, but wasn't. A dimly lit room. The walls were stone, cold and jagged. The air was stale, thick with dust and age. Jack took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow. The red scarf was still in his hands. It felt oddly light now, like it no longer belonged to him. He glanced around the room. It was small, bare. A single window high on the wall let in a weak sliver of light. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners, but the rest of the room was almost peaceful. Too peaceful. He walked further in, but his footsteps were too loud in the stillness. Every sound echoed unnervingly. A chill swept through the room, making Jack shiver. It felt like someone was watching him. He turned sharply, but there was no one. Nothing. Only the suffocating quiet. But something was wrong. The longer he stood there, the more his skin crawled. A whisper, faint and distant, fluttered at the edges of his mind. Jack. He froze, the sound creeping under his skin. It was the same voice from before, that cold, mocking tone. Jack, you can't escape. Jack clenched his fists around the scarf, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Leave me alone, he whispered, his voice hoarse and shaking. The voice laughed. It was soft, like a whisper in the wind. And then a figure emerged from the shadows, slowly deliberate. Not Alex, not the twisted thing he'd seen before. No, this was someone else. Someone familiar. A woman. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes black voids. She took a step toward him, her lips twisted into a smile. "You shouldn't have come here, Jack," she said, her voice low, like a sweet song with a venomous edge. The red scarf in Jack's hands pulsed. He could feel it. Asterisk at asterisk was alive. It was calling to him. "Pick it up," the woman whispered, her eyes glowing with that same hollow light. Jack's hand shook as he lifted the scarf, against his will. And in that instant, the world fell away. Everything around him shattered, as if the very air was tearing apart. The walls crumbled, the light faded, and the shadows twisted into monstrous shapes. The woman's grin grew wider. "Now you understand," Jack screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then silence, the silence was suffocating. Jack's breath was ragged, his chest tightening with every shallow gasp. He stood there, trembling, the red scarf still clutched tightly in his hands. The woman, her ghostly figure, was gone. The room, if it could even be called that, was empty once more. The walls were no longer stone, but mere shadows, dissolving in front of him. The air was still. The pressure was gone. The weight, the suffocating presence, it had lifted. Jack blinked, unsure if he was still dreaming, if this was another trick. But it felt real. It felt final. His body ached, and he dropped to his knees, his legs giving out beneath him. The scarf, now slack in his hands, was still warm, but it no longer burned. He stared at it, his heart pounding as if trying to escape his chest. For a long time, there was nothing but the quiet, stretching out endlessly around him. It was as though the world had taken a deep breath, waiting. Finally, Jack stood again. He looked around. No more figures, no more whispers. The air was clear, fresh even. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack wasn't afraid. But something still lingered in the pit of his stomach, a sense that he was on the edge of something bigger than himself, something he couldn't escape. He glanced down at the scarf, now perfectly still in his hands. It wasn't just an object. It was a reminder of the place, the darkness, the choices he had made. With a shaky breath, Jack turned away from the empty room, from the lingering shadows. He took a step forward, then another. The door, which had been missing, appeared before him, bathed in soft light. For the first time in so long, Jack felt hope, fragile but real, flutter in his chest. He didn't look back. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Jack stepped through. Beyond it was a new world, unfamiliar, yet full of possibilities. A world where the red scarf could never reach him again. He walked forward, leaving the shadows behind, leaving the past in the dark. And as the door closed softly behind him, the room fell silent once more.